Welcome to StoryStream Audiobooks, where the stories come alive. Books for days, come take a dive.
Crocodile Tears by Anthony Horowitz. Read by Dan Stevens. Chapter 1. Firestar. Ravi Chandra was going to be a rich man. It made his head spin to think about it. In the next few hours, he would earn more than he had managed in the last 20 years. A fantastic sum, paid in cash, right into his hands. It was the start of a new life. He would be able to buy his wife the clothes she wanted, a car, a proper diamond ring to replace the flimsy band of gold she had worn since they were married. He would take his 2 young boys to Disneyland in Florida. And he would travel to London and see the Indian cricket team play at Lord's, something he had dreamt about all his life, but had never thought possible. Until now. He sat hunched up beside the window of the bus that was taking him to work, as he had done every day for as long as he could remember. It was devilishly hot. The fans had broken down once again, and of course the company was in no hurry to replace them. Worse still, this was the end of June, the time of year known in South India as Agni Nakshatram, or Firestar. The sun was unforgiving. It was almost impossible to breathe. The damp heat clung to you from morning till night, and the whole city stank. When he had money, he would move. He would leave the cramped 2-room flat in Perambur, the busiest, most crowded part of the city, and go and live somewhere quieter and cooler, with a little more space to stretch out. He would have a fridge full of beer and a big plasma TV. Really, it wasn't so much to ask. The bus was slowing down. Ravi had done this journey so many times that he would have known where they were with his eyes closed. They had left the city behind them. In the distance there were hills, steep and covered, every inch of them, with thick green vegetation. But the area he was in now was more like a wasteland, with just a few palm trees sprouting among the rubble, and electricity pylons closing in on all sides. His place of work was just ahead. In a moment, they would stop at the first security gate. Ravi was an engineer. His identity badge with his photograph and full name, Ravindra Manpreet Chandra, described him as a plant operator. He worked at the Jawada nuclear power station just 3 miles north of Chennai, the 4th largest city in India, formerly known as Madras. He glanced up, and there was the power station in front of him, a series of huge, multicolored blocks, securely locked inside miles and miles of wire. It sometimes occurred to him that wire defined Jawada. There was razor wire and barbed wire, wire fences and telephone lines, and the electricity that they manufactured was carried all over India by thousands more miles of wire. How strange to think that when someone turned on their TV in Pondicherry, or their bedside light in Nellore, it had all begun here. The bus stopped at the security point with its CCTV cameras and armed guards. Following the 9/11 attacks on New York and Washington, nuclear power plants all over the world had become recognized as potential terrorist targets. New barriers had been added. Security forces had been enlarged. For a long time it had all been a damned nuisance, with people ready to jump on you if you so much as sneezed. But people had got lazy. Take old Suresh, for example, the guard at this outer checkpoint. He recognized everyone on the bus. He saw them at the same time every day, in at 7:30, out at 5:30. Occasionally he'd bump into them, strolling past the shops on Ranganatha Street. He even knew their wives and girlfriends. It wouldn't have occurred to him to ask for ID, or to check what they were carrying into Jawada. He waved the bus through. 2 minutes later, Ravi got out. He was a short, skinny man with bad skin and a moustache that sat uncomfortably on his upper lip. He was already wearing overalls and protective steel-capped shoes. He was carrying a heavy toolbox. Nobody asked him why he'd taken it home. It was quite possible that he'd had to fix something in the flat where he lived. Maybe he'd been moonlighting, doing some jobs for the neighbours for a few extra rupees. Ravi was always carrying a toolkit. It was as much a part of him as an arm or a leg. The bus had come to a final halt beside a brick wall with a door which, like every door at Jawada, was made of solid steel, designed to hold back smoke, fire, or even a direct missile strike. Another guard and more television cameras watched as the passengers got out and went through. On the other side of the door, a blank, whitewashed corridor led to a locker room, one of the few places in the complex that wasn't air-conditioned. Ravi opened his locker. There was a pin-up of the Bollywood star Shilpa Shetty stuck inside the door, and took out a safety helmet, goggles, earplugs, and a fluorescent jacket. He also removed a bunch of keys. Like most nuclear power stations, there were very few swipe cards or electronic locks on the doors at Jawada. This was another safety measure. Manual locks and keys would still operate in the event of a power failure. Still clutching his toolbox, Ravi set off down another corridor. When he had first come to work here, he'd been amazed how clean everything was, especially when he compared it with the street where he lived, which was full of rubbish and potholes with muddy water, and droppings from the oxen which lumbered along, pulling wooden carts between the cars and the motorized rickshaws. He turned a corner, and there was the next checkpoint, the final barrier he would have to pass through before he was actually in. For the first time, he was nervous. He knew what he was carrying. He remembered what he was about to do. What would happen if he was stopped? He would go to jail, perhaps for the rest of his life. He had heard stories about Chennai Central Prison, about inmates buried in tiny cells far underground, and food so disgusting that some preferred to starve to death. But it was too late to back out now. If he hesitated or did anything suspicious, that was one sure way to get stopped. He came to a massive turnstile with bars as thick as baseball bats. It only allowed one person in at a time, and then you had to shuffle through as if you were being processed like some sort of factory machine. There was also an X-ray scanner, a metal detector, and yet more guards.
Hey, Ravi. Ramesh, my friend, you see the cricket last night? I saw it. What a match. 2 wickets down and we still came back. I thought we were finished.
Cricket, football, tennis, whatever. Sport was their currency. Every day, the plant operators passed it between them, and Ravi had deliberately watched the match the night before so that he could join in the conversation. Even in the cool of the corridor, he was sweating. He could feel the perspiration beading on his forehead, and he wiped it away with the back of his hand. Surely someone would stop him and ask him why he was still holding on to his toolbox. Everyone knew the correct procedure. It should be opened and searched, all the contents taken out. But it didn't happen. A moment later, he was through. Nobody had so much as questioned him. It had gone just as he hoped it would. Nobody had lifted off the top tray of the toolbox and discovered the 10 kilos of C4 plastic explosive concealed underneath. Ravi walked away from the barrier and stopped in front of a row of shelves. He pulled out a small plastic device that looked like a pager. This was his EPD, or electronic personal dosimeter, which recorded his own radiation level and warned him if he came into contact with any radioactive material. It was set with his personal ID and security clearance. There were 4 levels of security at Jawada, each one allowing access to areas with different risks of contamination. Just for once, Ravi's EPD had been set to the highest level. Today he was going to enter the heart of the power station, the reactor chamber itself. This was where the deadly flame of Jawada burned. 60,000 uranium fuel rods, each one 3.85 meters long, bound together inside the pressure vessel that was the reactor itself. Every minute of the day and night, 20,000 tons of fresh water was sent rushing through pipes. The resulting steam, 2 tons of it every second, powered the turbines. The turbines produced electricity. That was how it worked. In many ways, it was very simple. A nuclear reactor is at once the safest and the most dangerous place on the planet. An accident might have such nightmarish consequences that there can be no accident. The reactor chamber at Jawada was made out of steel-reinforced concrete. The walls were 1.5 meters thick. The great dome, stretching out over the whole expanse, was the height and breadth of a major cathedral. In the event of a malfunction, the reactor could be turned off in seconds, and whatever happened in this chamber would be contained. Nothing could be allowed to leak through to the outside world. 1,000 safeguards had been built into the construction and the running of Jawada. One man, with a dream of watching cricket in London, was about to blow them apart. The approach had come 6 weeks before, at the street corner closest to his flat. 2 men, one a European, the other from Delhi. It turned out that the second man was a friend of Ravi's cousin, Jagdish, who worked in the kitchen of a 5-star hotel. Once they had recognized each other, it seemed only natural to go for tea and samosas, particularly as the European was paying. "How much do they pay you at Jawada?" "Only 15,000 rupees a month. A child couldn't live on that amount, and you have a wife and family. These people, they cheat the honest worker. Maybe it's time they were taught a lesson." Very quickly the conversation was steered the way the 2 men wanted it to go. And that first time they left him with a gift, a fake Rolex watch. And why not? Jagdish had done them favours in the past, giving them free food which he stole from the kitchen. Now it was their turn to look after Ravi. The next time they met, a week later, it was an iPhone, the real thing. But the gifts were only a glimpse of all the riches that could be his if he would just agree to undertake a piece of business on their behalf. It was dangerous. A few people might be hurt. But for you, my friend, it will mean a new life. Everything you ever wanted can be yours. Ravi Chandra entered the reactor chamber of the Jawada nuclear power station at exactly 8 o'clock. 5 other engineers went in with him. They had to go in one at a time through an airlock, a white circular corridor with an automatic sliding door at each end. In many ways it looked like something out of a spaceship, and its purpose was much the same. The exit wouldn't open until the entrance had closed. It was all part of the need for total containment. The 5 men were dressed identically, with safety helmets and goggles. All of them were carrying toolboxes. For the rest of the day they would carry out a series of tasks, some of them as ordinary as oiling a valve or changing a light bulb. Even the most advanced technology needs occasional maintenance. As they emerged from the airlock into the reactor chamber, they seemed almost to vanish, so tiny were they in these vast surroundings, dwarfed by the bright yellow gantries and walkways overhead, by electric hoists and cables, soaring banks of machinery, fuel rod transportation canisters and generators. Arc lamps shone down from the edges of the dome, and in the middle of it all, surrounded by ladders and platforms, what looked like an empty swimming pool plunged 12 meters down, with stainless steel plates on all 4 sides. This was the reactor. Underneath a 150-ton steel cap, millions of uranium atoms were splitting again and again, producing unimaginable heat. 4 metal towers stood guard in the chamber. If they were shaped a little like rockets, they were rockets that would never fly. Each one was locked in its own steel cage and connected to the rest of the machinery by a network of massive pipes. These were the reactor coolant pumps, keeping the water rushing round on its vital journey. Inside each metal casing, a 50-ton motor was spinning at the rate of 1,500 revs per minute. The pumps were labelled north, south, east and west. The south pump was going to be Ravi's primary target. But first of all, he crossed to the other side of the reactor chamber to a door marked emergency exit only. The 2 men had explained everything very carefully to him. There was no point attacking the reactor cap. Nothing could penetrate it. Nor was there any point in sabotaging the reactor chamber, not while it was locked down. Any blast, any radiation leak would be contained. To achieve their aims, an exit had to be found. The power of the nuclear reactor had to be set free. And there it was, on the blueprint they had shown him. The emergency airlock was the Achilles heel in the fortification of Jawada. It should never have been built. There was no need for it, and it had never been used. The reason for a passageway between the reactor chamber and the back of the turbine hall, where it opened onto a patch of wasteland close to the perimeter fence, was to reassure the workers that there was a fast way out if it should ever be needed. But what it also provided was a single pathway from the reactor to the outside world. In one sense, it was the barrel of a gun. All it needed was to be unblocked. Nobody noticed Ravi as he strolled over to the emergency door, and even if they had, they wouldn't have remarked on it. Everyone had their own worksheet. They would assume he was just following his. He opened the inner door, a solid metal plate, and let himself into the corridor. About halfway along there was a control panel fixed high up in the wall. Standing on tiptoe, Ravi unscrewed it, using one of the few real tools he had brought with him. Inside there was a complicated mass of circuitry, but he knew exactly what to do. He cut 2 separate wires, then spliced them together. It was quite easy, really. The exit door slid open in front of him, revealing a patch of blue sky beyond a wire fence. He felt the sluggish air roll in. Somewhere, perhaps in the control room, someone would notice what had happened. Even now a light might be blinking on one of the consoles. But it would be a while before anyone came to investigate, and by then it would be too late. Ravi went back into the reactor chamber and over to the nearest of the 4 reactor coolant pumps. This was the only way that wide-scale sabotage was possible. What he was aiming for was known in the nuclear industry as a LOCA, a loss of coolant accident. It was a LOCA that had caused the catastrophe at Chernobyl, and had almost done the same at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, America. The pump was locked in its cage, but Ravi had the key. That was one of the reasons he had been chosen for this job. The right man in the right place. He stopped in front of the cylindrical wall that rose more than 20 meters into the air. He could hear the machinery inside. The noise was constant and deafening. His mouth was dry now as he thought about what he was going to do. Was he mad? Suppose they traced this back to him. But at the same time there was cricket, Ajala, his wife, Disneyland, a new life. His family were not in Chennai today. He had sent them to friends in Bangalore. They would be safe. He was doing this for them. He had to do this for them. For a few brief seconds, greed and fear hung in the balance, but then the scale tipped. He knelt down and placed the toolbox against the metal casing, opened it and removed the top shelf. The inside was almost filled with the bulk of the plastic explosive, but there was just room for the timer. A digital display showing 10 minutes, a tangle of wires and a switch. 10 minutes. That would be more than enough time to leave the chamber before the bomb went off. He would exit the same way he had come in, and once he was on the other side of the airlock, he would be safe. If anyone questioned him, he would say he needed the toilet. After the blast, there would be panic, alarms, a well-rehearsed evacuation, radiation suits for everyone. He would simply join the crowds and make his way out. They would never be able to trace the bomb to him. There wouldn't be any evidence at all. People might die. People he knew. Could he really do this? The switch was right there in front of him, so small. All he had to do was flick it and the countdown would begin. Ravi Chandra took a deep breath. He reached out with a single finger. He pressed the switch. It was the last thing he did in his life. The men from the street corner had lied to him. There was no 10-minute delay. When he activated the bomb, it went off immediately, almost vaporizing him. Ravi was dead so quickly that he never even knew that he'd been betrayed, that his wife was now a widow, and that his children would never meet Mickey Mouse. Nor did he see the effect of what he had done. Exactly as planned, the bomb had torn a hole in the side of the coolant pump, smashing the rotors. There was a hideous metallic grinding as the entire thing tore itself apart. One of the other plant operators, the same man who had been chatting about cricket just a few minutes ago, was killed instantly, thrown off his feet and into the reactor pit. The other engineers in the chamber froze. Their eyes filled with horror as they saw what was happening, then scattered, diving for cover. They were too late. There was another explosion, and suddenly the air was filled with shrapnel, spinning fragments of metal and machinery that had been turned into vicious missiles. The two closest men were cut to pieces. The others turned to run for the airlock. None of them made it. Sirens were already sounding, lights flashing, as the machinery disintegrated. Everything in the chamber turned into a black and red hell. A cable whipped down, trailing sparks. There were 3 more explosions, pipes wrenching themselves free, fireballs spinning outwards, and then a roar as burning steam came rushing out like an express train. The worst had happened. Jagged knives of broken metal had smashed open the pipes, and although the reactor was already closing down, there were several tons of radioactive steam with nowhere to go. One man was caught in the full blast and disappeared with a single hideous scream. The steam thundered out, filling the entire chamber. Normally the walls and the dome would have contained it, but Ravi Chandra, in almost the last act of his life, had opened the emergency airlock. Like some alien stampede, the steam found it and burst through, out into the open air. All over the Jawada power station, systems were being shut down, corridors emptied, emergency safety measures put into place. But it was already too late. The people of Chennai saw a huge plume of white smoke rise up into the air. They heard the alarms. Workers at Jawada were calling their relatives in the city, warning them to get out. The panic began at once. More than 1 million men, women and children dropped what they were doing and tried to find a way through traffic that had come to a complete standstill. Fights broke out. There were collisions and smash-ups at a dozen different junctions and traffic lights. But it had all happened too quickly, and not a single person made it out of the city before the radioactive cloud, blown by a northerly wind, fell onto them. The story appeared that night on television news all around the world. It was estimated that at least 100 people had died in the hour following the explosion. There had been casualties within the Jawada power station itself, but curiously far more were killed in the mad crush to get out of Chennai. By the following morning, the newspaper headlines were calling it a nuclear nightmare, in capital letters, of course. The Indian authorities were adamant that the steam cloud would have contained only low-level radiation, and that there was no need for panic. But there were just as many experts who disagreed. 24 hours later, an appeal was made to help the people of Chennai. Further casualties were being reported. Homes and shops had been looted. There were still riots in the streets, and the army had been called in to restore order. The hospitals were full of desperate people. One British charity, it called itself First Aid, came forward with a comprehensive plan to distribute food, blankets, and most importantly of all, potassium iodate tablets for every one of the 8 million people of Chennai to counter possible radiation sickness. As always, the British people were unfailing in their generosity, and by the end of the week they had raised £1.25 million. Of course, if the disaster had been any greater, they would have raised much, much more. Chapter 2. Reflections in a Mirror. Alex Ryder took one last glance in the mirror, then stopped and looked a second time. It was strange, but he wondered if he recognized the boy who was looking back. There were the thin lips, the slightly chiseled nose and chin, the fair hair hanging in 2 strands over the dark brown eyes. He raised a hand, and obediently his reflection did the same. But there was something different about this other Alex Ryder. It just wasn't quite him. Of course, the clothes he was wearing didn't help. In a few minutes he would be leaving for a New Year's Eve party being held at a castle on the banks of Loch Arkaig in the Highlands of Scotland, and the invitation had been clear: dress, black tie. Reluctantly, Alex had gone out and rented the entire outfit: dinner jacket, black trousers and a white shirt with a stuck-up collar that was too tight and dug into his neck. The one thing he had refused to put on was the pair of polished leather shoes that the shop assistant had insisted would make the outfit complete. Black trainers would have to do. What did it all make him look like, he wondered, as he straightened the bow tie for the 10th time? A young James Bond. He hated the comparison, but he couldn't avoid it. It wasn't just the clothes. As Alex continued his examination, he had to admit that so much had happened in the last year, he'd almost lost track of who and what he was. Standing in front of the mirror, it was as if he had just stepped down off the merry-go-round that his life had become. He might be still, but the world around him was spinning. Just 2 months ago he'd been in Australia, not on holiday, not visiting relatives, but, incredibly, working for the Australian Secret Intelligence Service, disguised as an Afghan refugee. He'd been sent to infiltrate the people-smuggling gang known as the Snakehead, but his mission had taken him much further than that, setting him against Major Winston Yu and the potential devastation of a huge bomb buried deep inside a fault line in the Earth's crust. It had also brought him face to face with his godfather, the man he had known only as Ash. Thinking about him now, Alex saw something spark in his eyes. Was it anger? Grief? Alex had never known his parents, and he'd thought Ash would somehow be able to explain where he'd come from, to make sense of his past. But his godfather had done nothing of the sort, and their meeting had led instead to betrayal and death. And that was really it, wasn't it? That was what the boy in the mirror was trying to tell him. He was still only 14 years old, but this last year, a year whose end they were about to celebrate, had almost destroyed him. If he closed his eyes, he could still feel Major Yu's walking stick smashing into the side of his head, the crushing weight of the water under the Bora Falls, the punishment he had taken in the Thai boxing ring in Bangkok. And those were just the most recent in a string of injuries. How many times had he been punched, kicked, beaten, knocked out, and shot? His wounds might have healed, but he would still be reminded of them every time he undressed. The scar left by the .22 bullet fired into his chest by a sniper on a rooftop in Liverpool Street would always be with him. And the memory of pain. They say that never leaves you either. Had it changed him? Of course it had. Nobody could survive all this and stay the same. And yet... "Alex, stop admiring yourself in the mirror and get downstairs." It was Sabina. Alex turned and saw her standing in the doorway, wearing a silver dress with lots of glitter around the neckline. Her dark hair, she had grown it long, was tied back. Unusually for her, she was wearing makeup, pale blue eyeshadow and glossy pink lipstick. "Dad's waiting, we're about to leave." "I'll be 1 minute." Alex twisted the bow tie again, wondering what he had to do to stop the damn thing going crooked. He looked ridiculous. Nobody under the age of 50 should have to dress like this. But at least he'd been able to resist Sabina's suggestion that he should go to the party dressed in a kilt. She'd been teasing him about it since Christmas. Despite everything, the last 6 weeks had been fantastic for Alex Rider. First of all, Sabina and her parents had unexpectedly arrived in England. Edward Pleasure was a journalist. He'd almost been killed once, investigating a pop star called Damien Cray. Alex had blamed himself for that, and when, at the end of it all, Sabina had left for America, he had been certain he would never see her again. But now she was back in his life, and although she was a year older than he was, the two had never been closer. It helped, perhaps, that she was one of the few people who knew about his involvement with MI6. Better still, the Pleasures had invited Alex to join them for New Year at the house they had rented in the West Highlands of Scotland. Hawk's Lodge was a Victorian pile that had been named after an obscure poet rather than the bird. It stood 3 stories high on the edge of woodland, with Ben Nevis in the background. It was the sort of house that needed roaring log fires, hot chocolate, old-fashioned board games, and too much to eat. Liz Pleasure, Sabina's mother, had supplied all of this and more from the moment they had arrived. In the past few days, the 4 of them had gone hill-walking and fishing. They had visited ruined castles and isolated villages, and strolled along the famous white sands of Morar. Sabina had hoped it might snow. There was good skiing over at Cairn Gorm, and she had brought her gear with her. But although it was freezing outside, so far the weather had only managed a few flurries. There was no television in the house, and Edward had banned Sabina from bringing her Nintendo, so they had spent the evenings playing Scrabble or Perudo, the Peruvian game of liar dice, which Alex nearly always won. If there was one thing he had learnt in his life, it was how to lie. Meanwhile, Jack Starbright, Alex's housekeeper, and in many ways his closest friend, was in Washington. She had been invited up to Scotland too, but had decided to go home for New Year to see her parents. As he followed her out of the house, it had crossed Alex's mind that one day she would go back to America for good. Her parents and the rest of her family were there. He wondered what would happen to him when she did. She had looked after him since his uncle had died, and as far as he knew there was nobody to take her place. As if reading his thoughts, she had given him a hug while the taxi driver loaded her cases. "Don't worry, Alex. I'll see you in a week. Just try and have a good time in Scotland. See if you can make it past New Year without getting into trouble. Don't forget, school starts on the 6th. And that was another reason to be cheerful. Alex had managed to complete almost half a term at Brookland without getting kidnapped, shot at, or recruited by one of the world's security agencies. He had begun to feel like an ordinary schoolboy again, being told off for talking in class, sweating over his homework, listening out for the bell that meant the end of the day. He took one last look in the mirror. Jack was right. Forget James Bond. He'd had enough of all that. He was leaving it behind. He went down 2 flights of stairs to the wood-panelled hall with its rather gloomy paintings of Scottish wildlife. Edward Pleasure was waiting with Sabina. It seemed to Alex that the journalist had got quite a lot older since they had last met. There were definitely more lines in his face. He now wore glasses all the time, and he had lost a lot of weight. He also limped, supporting himself with a heavy walking stick, metal-tipped, and with a brass handle shaped like a duck's head. His wife had bought it for him in an antique shop in London. She had joked that if any of the people he wrote about ever tried to attack him again, at least he'd have something he could use to defend himself. That was what Alex liked most about this family. They stuck together, and no matter what happened, they always seemed to be cheerful. He had found it easy spending time with them, slipping into their routine. And Alex liked to imagine that, in many ways, his parents would have been just like Edward and Liz. The journalist had also put on black tie for the evening, but Alex saw at once that there was a problem. "What is it?" he asked. "Mum's not coming," Sabina replied. She was looking frustrated. Alex knew she had spent hours getting ready for the party. Now, at the last minute, something had gone wrong. "She says she's not feeling up to it," Edward explained. "It's nothing serious, just a touch of flu." "Then I think we should all stay," Sabina said. "That's nonsense, Sabina. The 3 of you go and enjoy yourselves." Liz Pleasure had appeared at one of the doorways. She was a pleasant, easygoing woman with long, straggly hair. She didn't care how she looked, and she liked to run a house without rules. Right now she was wearing a baggy jersey and jeans, holding a box of tissues. "I don't much like parties anyway, and I'm certainly not going out in this weather. But you get some of that expensive oil your dad bought me for Christmas. Then I'm going to bed. I'll be asleep long before midnight." She went over to Sabina and put her arm around her. "Honestly, Sab, it doesn't bother me. We can celebrate New Year tomorrow, and you can tell me what I've missed." "But, Mum, we won't enjoy it without you." "Of course you will. You love parties, and you look terrific, both of you." Liz Pleasure had made up her mind. "You have to go. Your dad's got the tickets, and they're worth a fortune." She beamed at Alex. "You look after her, Alex, and remember, this is a party in a real Scottish castle. Hogmanay and all the rest of it. I'm sure you're going to have a fantastic time." There was no point in any further argument, and 20 minutes later, Alex found himself being driven along the twisting roads that led north to Loch Arkaig. The weather had got worse. The snow that Sabina had been hoping for was falling more heavily, swirling in front of the headlights as they cut through the night. Edward Pleasure was driving a Nissan X-Trail, which he had rented at Inverness Airport. Alex was glad he had chosen a 4x4. The snow was already settling. Any thicker and they would need the extra traction. Sabina was stretched out in the back, untangling her iPod. Alex was in the front. It was the first time he'd been alone with Edward Pleasure since the south of France, and he felt a little uncomfortable. The journalist must have known about his involvement with MI6. Sabina would have told him everything that had happened. But the two of them had never discussed it, as if it was somehow impolite. "It's good to have you with us, Alex," Edward muttered. He was deliberately keeping his voice down so that Sabina, plugged into Coldplay, wouldn't hear. "I know Sab was really glad you could tag along." "I've had a great time," Alex said. He thought for a moment, then added, "I'm sorry about tonight, though." Edward smiled. "We don't have to stay too long if you don't want to, but what Liz said was right. Nobody celebrates New Year like the Scottish, and Kilmore Castle is quite a place. Dates back to the 13th century. It was torn down in the first Jacobite Rising and stayed more or less in ruins until it was bought by Desmond McCain." "Isn't he the man you're writing about?" "That's right. He's the main reason we're going. The Reverend Desmond McCain." Edward reached down and flicked a switch, blowing hot air over the windscreen. The wipers were doing their best, but the snow was still sticking to the glass surface. It was warm and cosy inside the car, in marked contrast with the world outside. "He's an interesting man, Alex. Do you know anything about him?" "Not really." "Oh, I thought you might have read about him in the papers. He was brought up in an orphanage in East London. No parents, no family, nothing. He'd been abandoned in a supermarket trolley, wrapped in a plastic bag, McCain oven chips. That's how he got his name. He was fostered by a couple in Hackney, and from that moment things started going better for him. He did well at school, at least in sport. By the time he was 18, he'd become a famous boxer. He won the WBO middleweight title twice, and everyone thought he'd make it a hat-trick, except he got knocked out in the first round by Buddy Sangster in Madison Square Garden in 1983. "Didn't something happen to Sangster?" Alex asked. He'd heard the name somewhere before. "That's right. He died a year later. He fell under a train in the New York subway. They showed his funeral on TV. One of his fans even sent him 100 black tulips. I remember hearing that." Edward shook his head. "Anyway, Desmond McCain wasn't boxing anymore. His jaw had been smashed up pretty badly. He went to some plastic surgeon in Las Vegas, but it was a botch job and it never healed properly. To this day he can only eat soft food. He can't chew. But it wasn't the end of him. He went into business, property development, and he was very good at it. There were a dozen families in Rotherhithe down on the River Thames, and somehow he persuaded them to sell cheaply to him, and then he knocked down their houses and put up a bunch of skyscrapers and made a fortune. That was about the time that he became interested in politics. He donated thousands of pounds to the Conservative Party, and suddenly he announced he wanted to be an MP. Of course, they welcomed him with open arms. He was rich, he was successful, and he was black. That was part of it too. And the next thing you know, he managed to get himself elected in a corner of London which hadn't voted Conservative since the 19th century, and even then it was only by mistake. People liked him. It was the typical rags-to-riches story. You could say plastic bag to riches in this case. He got a big majority, and a year later he was a minister in the Department for Sport. There was even talk that he could one day be our first black PM. So, what went wrong? Edward sighed. Everything. It turned out that his business hadn't been doing as well as people thought. One or two of his developments had fallen behind schedule, and he had huge financial problems. The bank was closing in, and it looked as if he might go bankrupt. And of course you're not allowed to be a member of Parliament if that happens. God knows what he was thinking, but he decided to set fire to one of his properties and claim on the insurance. That was his way out of the mess. Well, the property in question was a 24-storey office block overlooking St. Paul's, and one night it simply burned to the ground. The next day, McCain put in a claim for £50 million. Problem solved. They came to a sharp bend in the road, and Edward Pleasure slowed down. By now the whole road was snow-covered, with dark pine trees looming up on both sides. At least, that's what he thought, he went on. Unfortunately, the insurance company smelled a rat. They started asking questions, like, for example, why had the alarms been switched off? Why had the security staff been allowed to leave early? There was a lot of gossip in the press, and then, suddenly, a witness appeared. It turned out there'd been a homeless person sleeping in the underground car park. He'd been there when McCain drove in with 6 gallons of petrol and a cigarette lighter. He was lucky to get away alive. Anyway, McCain was arrested, and there was a fairly sensational trial. He was sent to prison for 9 years. Alex had listened to all this in silence. "You called him the Reverend McCain. he said. "Well, that's the strange thing. In a way, McCain's whole life had been bizarre, but while he was in jail, he converted to Christianity. He did a correspondence course and became a priest in some church no one's ever heard of. And when he got out, that was 5 years ago, he didn't go back into business or politics. He said he'd spent his whole life being selfish and he wanted to put all that behind him. Instead, he set up a charity. First Aid, that's what it's called. It provides a rapid response to emergencies all over the world." "How much further?" Sabina's voice came from the back seat. She was still plugged into her iPod. Edward Pleasure held up a hand and opened it twice, signalling 10 minutes. "You interviewed him," Alex said. "Yes, I've done a big piece for GQ. They'll be publishing it next month." "And?" "You'll meet him tonight, Alex, and you can see for yourself. He has an enormous amount of energy, and he's channeled it into helping people less fortunate than himself. He's raised millions for famine relief in Africa, bushfires in Australia, floods in Malaysia, even that accident in South India, Jawada." Alex nodded. He'd read about it when he'd been working as a ball boy at Wimbledon. It had made the front pages. "The nuclear reactor," he said. Edward nodded. "For a time it looked as if the whole city of Chennai could have been affected. Fortunately, it wasn't as bad as that, but a lot of people were killed in the panic. First Aid were up and running the very next day, getting anti-radiation stuff to the women and kids, helping with supplies, that sort of thing. Nobody was quite sure how they got off the mark so quickly, but that's how they work. Instant response. Their aim is to be the first charity in." "And you really think this man McCain is genuine?" "You mean, do I think he's another Damien Cray?" Edward smiled briefly. It had been his article exposing Cray as a maniac that had almost got him killed. "Well, I did have my doubts when I first met him. I mean, even if he wasn't a crook, he was a Tory politician, which didn't exactly recommend him. But you don't need to worry, Alex. I did a lot of research into his charity. I interviewed him, and I met people who knew him. I spoke to the police, and I opened their old files. The truth is, I couldn't find anything bad to write about him. He really does seem to be a rich man who made a bad mistake and who's trying to make up for it." "How come he owns a castle if he went bankrupt?" "That's a good question. After he went to prison, he lost all his money, everything. But he had powerful friends, both in the city and in the Tory party, and they did what they could to help him out. Thanks to them, he managed to hang on to Kilmore Castle. He also has a London flat, and he's the part owner of a business somewhere in Kenya." A car suddenly appeared in the road beside them, overtaking. Edward slowed down to let it pass. He watched as it was swallowed up by the whirling snow. "I'll be interested to hear what you think of McCain," he muttered. "Did he invite you?" "Yes, when I met him, I mentioned I was planning to be in Scotland for New Year, and he gave me 4 tickets. And it's just as well, they actually cost £300 each." Alex let out a low whistle. "Well, it's all for charity. All the profits will go to First Aid. There'll be a lot of rich people there tonight. They'll raise tens of thousands." There was another brief silence. The road had begun to climb steeply uphill, and Edward changed down a gear. "We never really talked about Damien Cray," Edward said. Alex twisted in his seat. "There's nothing to say. My book about him sold 1 million copies, but I never mentioned you or your part in what happened. I prefer it that way. You saved Sabina's life. She saved mine. Can I give you some advice, Alex?" Edward Pleasure had to keep his eyes on the road, but just for a moment he turned them on Alex. "Stay away from all that. MI6, intelligence, all the rest of it. I've a good idea what's been going on over the past year. Sabina's told me some of it, but I have contacts in the CIA and I hear things. I don't want to know what you've been through, but believe me, you're better off out of it. Don't worry. I don't think MI6 are interested in me anymore. They didn't even send me a Christmas card. That part of my life is over, and I'm glad." The road was even steeper now, and the trees had fallen away on one side to reveal an expanse of black water, Loch Arkaig, stretching out below. It was still snowing, but the flakes didn't seem to be making contact with the half-frozen surface, as if the two were somehow cancelling each other out. The loch was said to have its own monster, a giant water horse, and looking down, Alex could well believe it. Loch Arkaig had been left behind by the glaciers. 12 miles long, and in places 100 metres deep. Who could say what secrets it had managed to keep to itself for the past 1,000,000 years? And there was Kilmore Castle, looming up above him, almost invisible behind the sweeping snow. It had been built on a rocky outcrop above the loch, completely dominating the surrounding landscape. A massive pile of grey stone with towers and battlements, narrow, slit-like windows, soaring archways, and solid, unwelcoming doors. There was nothing about the place that had been built for comfort. It existed only to rule, and to keep those inside it in power. It was hard to imagine how it had ever fallen, or, for that matter, how it had been built. Even the Nissan X-Trail with its 2.2-litre four-cylinder turbo diesel engine seemed to be struggling as it negotiated the tight hairpin bends that were the only way up. Had soldiers once come here on horseback? How could they possibly have penetrated those massive walls? They were in a queue of traffic now, with other partygoers just visible behind the frosted windows of their cars. The last bend brought them to a wide-open space which had been converted into a car park, with attendants in day-glow jackets frantically signalling where to go. 2 fiery torches had been placed on either side of the main entrance, the flames fighting the snow. Men and women in heavy coats, their faces lost behind scarves, were hurrying across the gravel and bundling themselves in. There was something almost nightmarish about the scene. It didn't look like a party. These people could have been refugees, running for their lives from some freak act of nature. Edward Pleasure parked the car, and Sabina took off her iPod. "We don't have to stay until midnight," her father told her. "If you want to leave earlier, just let me know." "I wish Mum had come," Sabina muttered. "Me too. But you know she wouldn't want us to worry about her. Let's just have fun." They got out of the car, and after the warmth of the interior, Alex was immediately hit by the deep chill of the night, the snow dancing in front of his eyes, the wind rushing through his hair. He had no coat and broke into a run, hugging himself, using his shoulders to battle through the elements. It was as if the very worst of the winter had somehow been concentrated on this rocky platform high above the loch. The flames of the beacons writhed and twisted. Somebody shouted something, but the words were snatched away. And then they had reached the archway and passed through into an inner courtyard where at least the wind couldn't penetrate. Alex found himself in an irregularly shaped space with high walls, cannons, and a huge bonfire. About a dozen guests were crowded round it, feeling the warmth and laughing as they brushed snow off their sleeves. A second archway stood ahead of him, this one with carved eagles and an inscription in Gaelic, the letters glowing red and shimmering in the light of the fire. "Hach Dianas scris naiden goose am biar fis koiad." "What's that?" Sabina asked. Edward shrugged, but next to him one of the other guests had overheard. "It's the motto of the Kilmore clan," he explained. "This was their ancestral home. They were here for 300 years. "Do you know what it means?" "Yes. You cannot defeat your enemies until you know who they are." The guest pushed forward and disappeared into the castle. Alex stared at the inscription. He wondered if in some way it wasn't speaking to him. Then he dismissed the thought. A new year was about to begin, and with it a new set of rules. There were no more enemies. That was what he had decided. "Come on, Alex." Sabina grabbed his arm, and together they went in. Chapter 3. Cards Before Midnight. Alex had never been to a party like it. The banqueting hall at Kilmore Castle was huge, but even so it was jammed with people. 500 or 600 of them had been invited, and this wasn't an invitation anyone was going to turn down, even if it came with a £300 price tag. Within minutes, Alex had spotted half a dozen TV celebrities and soap stars, a clutch of politicians, 2 celebrity chefs and a pop star. The men were in black tie or kilts. The women had fought to outdo one another with yards of silk and velvet, plunging necklines, and a dazzling assortment of diamonds and jewels. A whole army of waiters, in full Highland dress, were pushing their way through the crowd, carrying trays of vintage champagne, while a trio of bagpipe players performed on a gallery above. There were no electric lights. Over 100 candles flickered in 2 massive chandeliers. Torches blazed from iron braziers mounted in the walls. The far wall was dominated by a massive stone fireplace, with flames leaping up the chimney and throwing red shadows across the flagstone floor. The Kilmores hadn't lived at the castle for centuries, but they were certainly present tonight. Life-size portraits hung on the walls, grim-looking men with swords and shields, proud-eyed women in tartan and bonnets. Suits of armour had been mounted in many of the alcoves, and crossed swords stood guard over every archway and door. The animals they had killed, stags, foxes, wild boar, looked down on the scene with their disembodied heads and glass eyes. Coats of arms dotted the walls, the fireplace, even the windows. Desmond McCain must have spent a fortune on the party, ensuring that at the very least his guests would get value for money. A buffet table reached from one end of the hall to the other, piled high with salads and great slabs of beef and venison, whole salmon, and, on one giant silver platter, a roast suckling pig, complete with angry eyes and an apple in its mouth. There were dozens of different wines and spirits, punch bowls, and as many as 50 brands of malt whisky in bottles of various shapes. One archway led to a dance floor, another to a billiard room with a tournament already underway. Somehow McCain had managed to park a brand-new Mini Cooper convertible in the hallway. It was the first prize in a raffle that also included a Kawasaki Ultra 260X jet ski and a 2-week Caribbean cruise, all of them given free to first aid by wealthy sponsors. Outside, the snow was still falling. The wind was cutting through the night like a scalpel, but all that was forgotten as, inside, the guests enjoyed the warmth of each other's company and the spirit of the celebration as the minutes ticked down to New Year. And yet, despite all this, Alex and Sabina felt a little out of place. Not many other teenagers had been invited, and the ones they met all lived locally, seemed to be at least 6 feet tall, and clearly regarded them as outsiders. They ate together and had a couple of drinks and made their way to the dance floor, but even here they didn't feel comfortable, surrounded by adults twisting and swaying to music that had been written before Alex was born. "I've had enough of this," Sabina announced as the band lurched into an ABBA classic. Alex knew what she meant. The centre of the dance floor was dominated by 3 bold men in kilts, jabbing their fingers into the air to the tune of "Money, Money, Money." He glanced at his watch. It was only 11:10. "I don't think we can leave yet, Sabina," he said. "Did you see where Dad went?" "He was talking to one of the politicians. Probably hoping to get a story. He never stops. Come on, Sabina, cheer up. This place is hundreds of years old. Let's go and explore." They pushed their way off the dance floor and headed down the nearest corridor. It twisted round, and the music and the noise of the party were cut off almost at once. Another corridor led off it, this one decorated with tapestries and heavy gilt mirrors, with glass blackened by age. At the end they came to a staircase which led to one of the towers, and suddenly they found themselves outside, surrounded by stone parapets, looking out into the white-spotted blackness that the night had become. "That's better," Sabina said. "I was suffocating in there." "Are you cold?" Alex could see the snow falling gently onto her bare neck and shoulders. "I'll be all right for a minute." "Here." He took off his jacket and handed it to her. "Thanks." She slipped it on. There was a pause. "I wish I didn't have to go back to America," she said. Her words jolted Alex. He had forgotten that she would be returning in a few days' time. She'd enrolled at a school in San Francisco where the family was living, and it would be a while before they saw each other again. He'd be sorry when she'd gone. He'd got used to having her around. "Maybe I could come over in the Easter holidays," he said. "Have you been to San Francisco?" "Once. My uncle took me on a business trip. At least, that's what he told me. He was probably working with the CIA, spying on someone or something." "Do you ever think about Damien Cray?" "No." Alex shook his head. The question seemed to have come out of nowhere. He glanced at Sabina and was surprised to see that she was looking at him with something close to anger in her eyes. "I do. All the time. It was horrible. He was mad. And the way he died. I'll remember that for the rest of my life." Well, that made sense. Sabina had been there at the very end. In fact, she had been at least partly responsible for his sensational death. "I thought you said you were going to stop all that," she went on, "playing at being a spy." "It was never my choice," Alex replied. "And anyway, I've already told your dad. I've stopped. It's not going to happen again." Sabina sighed. "San Francisco's great," she said. "Great shops, great food, great weather. But I miss England." She paused. "I miss you. I'll come out, I promise. You'd better." They'd only been outside for a couple of minutes, but in this weather it was more than enough. Alex could see the flakes of snow in Sabina's hair. "Let's go downstairs," he suggested. "Yeah, let's find Dad and get out of here. I want to get back to Mum. I'll go to the main hall, you look in the other rooms. If you ask me, this party sucks. All these men in kilts and not one of them with decent legs." She handed him his jacket, and the two of them made their way back down the twisting staircase, then split up, searching for Edward Pleasure. Alex watched Sabina hurry down the corridor, then went the other way, past more unsmiling portraits of long-dead ancestors. He wondered why anyone would want to live in a place like this. Maybe Desmond McCain needed somewhere to hide from the world, when he wasn't trying to help it. He heard the murmur of voices, the clink of a glass, and a woman laughing. He had come to a set of double doors, opening into what had to be the castle's library. There were shelves of leather-bound books that looked hundreds of years old and were surely never read. He saw at once that the library had been converted into a casino, with card tables, a spinning roulette wheel, and croupiers in white shirts, waistcoats, and bow ties. As he walked in, the roulette ball tumbled into its slot with a loud clunk. The audience laughed and applauded, and the croupier called out, 18 red even, and began to sort out the chips. There were almost 100 people playing the different games, most of them holding drinks, and one or two of them puffing on cigars. This was the only room in the castle where smoking was allowed, and a film of smoke hung in the air. Alex didn't mean to go in. He looked briefly at the cards sliding across the green baize, the fresh chips stacking up in front of the roulette wheel, the men and women, some standing, some sitting, leaning forward, their faces flushed with excitement. The main focus of attention seemed to be at the far end of the room. There was a game in progress with 6 players, but one of them had just lost. Alex saw him throw his cards down with disgust and get up, leaving an empty chair. At the same time, the winning player laughed, a deep, rich sound that warmed the room. Desmond McCain. It had to be him. Alex would have known it even if he hadn't been the only black man there. McCain was lolling back in his chair in front of a great window which had the effect of framing him, putting him in the center of the picture. Almost despite himself, Alex moved forward to get a closer look. He'd been thinking about McCain only a few minutes ago. It couldn't hurt to see what the Laird of Kilmore Castle was really like.